So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night to everyone, and a very warm welcome to friends all over the world. Hello, everyone. We're so pleased if you're joining us for the first time today, and you are most welcome. We start with a short time of silence and prayer. Then we hear from Kevin Gallagher, Joyce Shepherd Thorne, Rhiannon Parry Thompson, and Angela Hanley. We'll record the meeting up to that point, after which the recording will stop, so that people will feel free to make comments and ask questions, and particularly to also say about what you'd like to say about speaking out. So it's not just comments or questions. You may have something to say about speaking out. So there will be instructions about how you put your hand up. I think Mary Ring will do that a bit nearer to the time. And what I'd like to say is that she'll also say about if it's going to be public, anything that goes into the chat, but Mary will remind you. Our approach in Root and Branch is that we are a forum for inclusivity and reform of the Roman Catholic Church initially, as that institution likes to offer cut and dried answers to many of the complex issues and dilemmas we face. We see the purpose of spirituality as being open to listening and questioning. We are a forum because we know that none of us have all the answers. So we positively welcome a breadth of views here in Root and Branch. Welcome, everybody. And I now hand over to Mary Varley. Thank you.
I'm going to start our 2-minute silence, and then after that, I'll just say a short prayer. In silence, I learn how to listen, to search for, and listen to that still small voice inside, the voice of the Spirit within. I pray that the silence can teach me what should not be said, but also what must be said. And when the listening is over, give me, Spirit, the courage to speak from that place of deep inner authority, the space where the Spirit resides in me. Let that still, small voice within be not only a voice for ourselves, but also a voice for those who have no voice. Let it be a channel so that the God in me may touch the God in you. Amen. Thank you, Kevin. And now I'm going to hand over to Holly, who is going to introduce the evening. Thank you.
Right. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Kevin, who's leading our evening tonight. Kevin is from Glasgow, but lives in Fareham, Hampshire, in the UK now. He trained as an electronic engineer and worked in high design tech for many years. But he found that he was searching for deeper meaning in life. So in 1990, he went to Taiwan for 2 years on a 2-year placement in a Jesuit residential center for very disabled children or children with learning difficulties. And he started a charity while he was there with other colleagues for severely disabled children and migrants. And 2 years became 26. He came back to the UK in 2016. And he found what he thought would be a dream job with the Catholic Church, and was working on projects for the homeless and asylum seekers, refugees, and so on. And it was amazing work, but the clerical church environment was anything but. And what he experienced there was not conducive to his mental well-being. That led to a long period of discernment and questioning and speaking out, which got him into hot water and remains hot to this day. So Kevin resigned from church employment and retrained and qualified as a psychotherapist. And he now offers affordable counseling to people who couldn't afford it otherwise. Kevin's passionate about understanding human behavior and how and why we get stuck into negative thinking. And he questions, what does it mean to be human? Kevin joined Root and Branch a few years ago and found a spiritual home. And he says it's one where the heating is turned on. So over to you, Kevin.
Thank you. Thank you, Holly, for that very, very nice introduction. A very long time ago, I worked for a large international organization where speaking out and being open to new ideas was not just encouraged, but it was actually expected. In that organization, there was a program called Speak Up, where employees could formally write and express anything that they thought needed addressing in the organization. There was also an open door policy where employees were free to approach any manager they wished. Of course, there was also a suggestion box. And also interestingly, there was a program where every 3 years employees would evaluate managers. In meetings, it was expected that everyone would have a say. The organization knew that allowing people to speak is good for everyone, good for creativity, good for growth, and I suppose, let's be honest, good for profits. Then very recently, I worked for another large international organization, one of the biggest in the world, which had none of the above policies. Being free to speak was not encouraged. Before speaking, I had to think about what those with power might think or do before I opened my mouth. There was no open door policy, there was no speak up program, there was no suggestion box. There was no evaluation of managers. However, despite this, and in seeing things that were not right, speak out I did. This did not result in an invitation to a discussion, but rather led to a formal investigation, which could have led to disciplinary process with the potential of being sacked or being fired. I could go on, but I won't. Needless to say, I left that organization. So in one organization, speaking out was expected and it was encouraged. In another, it could get one into serious trouble. In the former, it felt good, not so in the other. One organization was a large multinational high-tech company. The other was the Catholic Church. I leave it to you, my dear Root and Branch friends, to decide for yourself which experience relates to which organization. But what happens to us when our voice is suppressed? What happens? Where do the frustrations go? Where does our suppressed voice go? It has to go somewhere. Well, it goes inside. So what do I do when what I am seeing in an organization or in a group, doesn't need to be an organization, it can be in any group setting. What do I do when what I am seeing and hearing is not in agreement with that voice that is deep inside me? Have any of you ever been at a meeting or in a group setting where what you are hearing is making you feel very uncomfortable? You feel a need to speak up, but then you know if you do speak up, it's going to upset those around me. But then if I don't speak up, am I not betraying myself? There seems to be no easy answer to this. But as any good therapist will tell you, be aware of your feelings. I can get myself into a real confusion of thoughts and just remain stuck going round and round in my head. But in being aware of the feelings, something else happens, because feelings don't lie. In the first organization I spoke about, there was congruence between thoughts and feelings, basically between head and heart. In the second, there wasn't. So, not to be able to speak out and express who I am is actually a suppression of myself. It's a suppression of who I am at my core level. I miss opportunities to be validated for just being who I am. I miss opportunities to connect with others at a deep level and experience growth and creativity that this brings. My voice is an expression of my lived existence, and it wants to speak out and connect with others and to create. Many of us here will have experienced having our voice suppressed in our church, and will know how that feels. In an extreme case, I have known those who spoke out and then were hit with gagging orders. Can I ask you to really think about that? A church that has a gospel of liberation will issue legally binding gagging orders. Putting it simply, being silenced is very damaging to my mental well-being. If my voice is silenced, it doesn't disappear, it goes inside and it generates repression, rage, frustration, and so on. Again, not good for my mental well-being. And if we don't listen to our voices, how are we going to create a synodal church? I take note again of what the psychologists tell us. If we don't create, we will destroy. This is something worth reflecting upon. There is no neutral position. If we don't create, we will destroy. For me personally, liberation came when I could face grieving for a church that could have listened but refused to grieve about leaders that spoke about love and forgiveness but didn't love or couldn't tolerate truth. To hear a gospel preached that spoke about liberation, about setting captives free, and then bound me up in dogmas and doctrines and canonical laws that resulted in me feeling shame for who I was. I felt infantilized by what Father said and what Mother Church was proclaiming. Just look at the language. It's very telling. It encouraged me not to think like an adult, which could result in a regression to a childlike state, and to contract out my personal authenticity to the parental institution. But to break free meant moving away from the group thinking. To be direct about it, it meant betraying my tribe, but not betraying myself. And this comes at a cost. But the reward was to personally grow based on what was inside me and not subcontracting it out to an external entity. I could remain loyal to my personal authenticity and to be free. Enough of me. We're now going to listen to some personal stories from three of our guests who we are delighted to have with us, Joyce, Angela, and Rhiannon, who will have experienced being dismissed, being minimized, or being unheard. We're going to recognize the courage it takes to refuse to be silenced and to give voice to their lived experience. Our aim is not to reopen wounds, but it's to honor resilience, to restore dignity and strengthen a community of witnesses who are no longer standing alone. Normally, we give a short introduction to our guests, but this time, Joyce, Rhiannon, and Angela will say a few words about themselves in their short talk. So I'm now going to hand over to our speakers, and our first speaker will be Joyce. So over to you, Joyce.
Well, hello, good evening. Something about myself. I think I'll start from one of the most significant and transformative experiences that I had. And that was joining the VMM and going to Africa in 1970. Before that, I had been to college. Then I was on a contract for 2 years. I stayed on for 4.5 years until my permit ran out and they wouldn't renew any more permits. So came back, more or less settled immediately in England, got married, later divorced, and started working. My first full-time job was working with Project Full Employ. It was a project started during the riots in Lewisham in London in the 1980s. Last year there was an exhibition about it at one of the exhibition centers in London. So that was using my experience as well. After that, I was doing some study as well. And after that, I went to teach at college, at Southern College. In the meantime, I was always on the management team of the VMM and also with the Justice and Peace group. I saw somebody from the same Justice and Peace group as I was. And other things, joining CND, and later on, quite a few years later, with liberation theology. All these were significant to me because the reason why they were significant, because I'm not an institution person. I really worked more on the justice and peace side from the gospel, from what I've seen the gospel is, from what I've seen following Jesus is, not necessarily. So that's more or less, and then I came back, then I joined VMM as full-time, left my job and was the general coordinator. We had to take VMM to Ireland, went to live in Ireland, and all that sort of stuff went on. And then after almost 30 years, I drove myself with a friend to Malta, which is my country. My background was in a very Catholic country, but it was so Catholic that you don't even take it very seriously because it's part of your culture. And especially as my mother wasn't very kind of religious in that way. So why it was so transformative, VMM? Because we had that long 1-month course. And I was able to listen to many of the people talking to us about the documents of the church. That was the Vatican Council. We got in the Second Vatican Council. We got in touch with them. We were able to have a different view for the church. So when I came back, I'm going to I picked out a couple of experiences where I spoke out. It was in a almost a spontaneous way. One of them was I was in a small group and the area bishop came in. He came up to us and at some point he asked me about what I had been doing with my life. So I said to him, one of the things I mentioned was, or my friend mentioned rather, that we were VMM, that we are from the VMM. And she went off and he looked straight at me and he said to me, I used to support VMM, but I am not going to support it anymore. I said, why? He said, because Edwina, who is the founder of this group, supports women ordination. That was the time when John Paul II had come out really strongly proclaiming that ordination was only for men. If the church had no power or authorization to ordain women. If it did, it meant that it was no longer the Church of Jesus Christ. So he went on, and I stood there listening. And at some point, he was going to turn round and go. So I said to him, but Jesus was very inclusive. He never excluded women from his group. But he said then he said to me, he only chose 12 apostles. And that means that only men can be ordained. And that's even coming from the Old Testament. The priests were only men, no women. I said, but that was a different time when women were not looked upon as being anything but women to have babies and, that sort of thing. I was just making conversation with him. And he said to me, no, that's because men, he said the ordination is not, the call to the priesthood is not a job, it's a vocation. So I said, but exactly, women can have that vocation as well, why not? He said, because God has not chosen them, Jesus has not chosen them to be part of that. He said, and remember, he chose 12 apostles. I said, how do you know he had chosen 12 apostles? Oh, he said, you must have read the gospel. I said, yes, I have read the gospel, but I've also read something else, that the gospels were written about 40 years or even longer than that. I had just actually read it in the Jerusalem Bible translation. So I said, it might have been the evangelists who left out the women and not Jesus. And by this time, he was getting really irate with me. And everybody else went away and left us kind of, having this argument. And I said, but you cannot, you don't know, we don't know, because, after 40 years, who's going to remember exactly what they did? And also, I said, in the situation, it might have been, they didn't want the women in that position because they were trying to attract people to become to follow Jesus, and men wouldn't be very happy to have women in that position. Anyway, and I refused to stop. I thought he will have to stop this. I'm not going to stop. So I stood there listening, and then suddenly when he couldn't answer anything else, he just turned his back and went. And I thought, well, why did I do that? But I did. It's at that time I didn't know what I know now about the scriptures, because since then I've learned an awful lot more. So it had repercussions, because some people from that parish group, particular group, weren't very happy with what I had done. But there were no big, repercussions for me or for anyone at that time. But he did actually meet me another time. And he said, are you still? Oh, no, at the end of it, I said, are you going to close VMM then? Because of it. Because I said, it's doing an awful lot of good work. He didn't answer that, turned around and went. That's right, that's when it was rent. So that was one of the first times that I really stood up, and I decided to stand there and not back down. He had to go, so he did. So that was one thing. That was one idea. In the meantime, I have often actually approached priests after homilies for saying something that was, ridiculous. But I'm going to take another episode where it was in public that I did speak out. And that was just recently, before the synod. The university theological department invited Sister Natalie Bakar to come and speak to them. And somebody, I don't know who, sent me an invitation. They said, you would be interested in this. She's going to come. I said, yeah, I'll come. And she gave a beautiful talk, explaining everything. I had already been on one of the group of talks from Ireland, actually, about it, because with us, nothing happened. And also, I listened to it. There were many people who put their hands up and made comments and how beautiful and how good, and this is going to make the church listen to us, and so on and so forth and so forth. And then I thought, no, this is not right. In fact, I had already written to the bishop about that when he came to talk to us, Bishop Charles Scicluna. And I had written a little note, in the chat. And I stood up and said, look, I've downloaded the Vademecum documentation. I've read everything. I've prepared myself for our parishes to take part in this. I said, and there isn't even a whisper about it at any time in our churches, at our mass. There hasn't been any letters from the bishop, pastoral letters from the bishop to the faithful. Nothing. Somebody told me there had been one at the very beginning, but that was all. I said, I don't watch Mass on TV, so I didn't see it. And then I said, I hope that this is not going to be one of those occasions like an appeasement occasion. We'll do it so that we won't let people keep talking about it and doing all sorts of things. And I hope that this really is seriously going to listen to us, not the clergy, we listening to them, but the clergy will listen to us and see what this is all about. And I sat down, and there were riots on both sides for having said that. So I said, well, Sister Natalie looked at me. She said nothing. We came out afterwards, and there were quite a few people who came up. Well, I'm glad you said that, because in our parish, nothing's happened either. And I'm glad you said that. And I'm glad you said, so why didn't you back me up then? So there are two of the occasions when I spoke out in a more formal way. The last time I had to write a letter to the Times. I think I showed it to some of you, because when our Archbishop proposed that we should have married clergy, there was riots in Malta. All the loads of articles against it in the paper for celibacy and for this and for that. But there were also a lot of letters from abroad in the tablets, in the National Catholic Reporter, in L'Aqua International, which doesn't exist anymore, supporting the idea and talking about it. And so I decided I was going to write a letter. And I wrote and I explained that many people are, really wanting this to happen for the simple reason that there weren't any priests around. And married priesthood is very well, people are very familiar with it in England, because half of England was full of married priests who came from the Anglican clergy, and a few pieces here and there. At the end of it, I said, and the Jesuit said, one of the Jesuits said, and of course there are a good group of people, women religious, and other women who are available. They are not married, celibate. They won't cost you anything. And they also have a vocation, very well trained. And he endorsed that about the women religious. There was no response to my letter, but it all quieted down and nothing happened. In between, I just go on, and whenever there is occasion, I stand up and respond to it. So that's
Joyce.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you,
Sorry, Kevin.
Joyce. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, yes, okay. Yeah, thank you, Joyce, for sharing those three experiences. There will be time later when we can ask questions of Joyce and also to hear from you about your own experience. But I'd like now to hand over to Rhiannon, our second speaker.
Hi,
So,
everybody.
yeah.
Thanks, Kevin. Hello, everybody. Well, I serve a very brief introduction to myself. I serve on the Root and Branch core team, and I'm always enriched by these community gatherings. I'm active within Catholic Women's Ordination UK, otherwise known as QWO, and the global organisation to which it's affiliated, Women's Ordination Worldwide. Wow. I work with languages, and I have a particular passion for Celtic languages. So if you want to pop a Welsh, Cornish, or Manx message in the chat, I'd be delighted. Outside of work, Root and Branch and QWO, I have a keen and a very active interest in animal justice. Well, folks, I have a vivid early childhood memory of setting places at the family supper table for Mary, Joseph, and Jesus. I don't know whether any of you ever did that when you were little. If the Holy Family lived with us, they should eat with us, I figured. And evening after evening, Mum quietly facilitated this gesture, bless her. Parishes and chaplaincies in later years underlined that growing sense of church and universal hospitality. And so when I read Mersey poet Roger McGough's poem for the opening of the Catholic Cathedral in Liverpool, UK, I understood. Quoting, "Let it not be a showroom for would-be good Catholics. Keep always a light in the window, a welcome mat in the hall, that it may be a home, sweet home, from home for all." And that sense of home, or a homecoming, if I disengaged for a while, was upended, quite brutally actually, when after a divorce and in the run-up to a second marriage, and with my little boy a second chance at family, clergy at the church, where I'd been active for a long time, made clear their disapprobation. My fiancé, a Northern Irish Presbyterian, when he inquired about a possible blessing for our marriage, he was told there could be no suggestion of approval for our irregular union because in the eyes of the church, our upcoming marriage wasn't valid nor ever would be. Post-marriage, and after months of going up the aisle for a blessing for fear of being outed at the altar, or as Richard Rohr puts it, and actually writing in this context, quietly shunned, it dawned on me that as hospitality embodies the gospel message, God did in fact want me, all of us, to eat and drink in her home. And resolving to reclaim my place at the table, I remember this clearly, was reinforced by a strong teenage memory of poet priest George Herbert's invitation to us to imagine the conversation between Christ and our hearts when we come to the communion table. Love, Christ, says that no matter your history, you must sit down and eat. My mum, unbeknown to me around this time, as she was seeking to become a member of the church, asked a priest why divorced and remarried Catholics weren't allowed to receive communion, because those are the rules, she was told. And the same strict protocols intended to protect the sanctity of the rite were doubtless applied when my husband, with the intention of showing love and solidarity by taking communion at an anniversary mass for my dad in a now different church, was told loudly enough for the congregation to hear that he couldn't. So I started talking with priests, with parishioners after coffee, with friends, and with my diocesan bishop. I said I felt that withholding the Eucharist meal from certain groups of people who had breached the rules or who weren't baptized Catholics, undermined Christian love. And speaking out, as Kevin said, there was a sense of freedom, of release, and finding actually that I wasn't alone. So what of these rules? Our friend Richard Rohr, again, writing in this context, wrote, "The clergy," this is exactly in this context, "are taking upon themselves a power that Christ never gave them." There's a reason that both Jesus and Paul were so critical of law, because they're both saying that there's a law higher than law, and that's the law of love. But law, he goes on, takes subtlety and discernment and timing and wisdom. And of course, I've met priests and deacons, we maybe all have, who are only too ready to offer unqualified welcome to full participation in this. And in this, let's hear it for the priests in our community, including the late Father Paul Thies, Quo Catholic Women's Ordination member and good Root and Branch friend. And thank you, Suzanne, in the chat for reminding us that for Roman Catholic women priests, all are welcome. I'm quoting you, all are welcome and all are equal. If this is your story, or part of it, I'd say take heart. This rule and other purity regulations, Tom McLaughlin's words, are coming under closer and closer scrutiny and being challenged by the grassroots and by an increasing number of religious priests and bishops and even cardinals. And you'll remember back to the 2024 Synod on Synodality, it didn't issue a single universal decree widening access to the Eucharist, but in the final document, Francis, who famously said that the Eucharist isn't a prize for the perfect, he emphasized a soft, pastoral approach focused on inclusion, accompaniment, and discernment for those who feel or who are excluded. And when I speak up, and I still do, I think of Jesus. The frequent accounts of our Lord offering and receiving hospitality affirm the place of welcome for everybody at his table with no strings attached. It's impossible. I think it's actually impossible to imagine Jesus keeping anything other than an open table. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Rhiannon. Again, we will have time later to ask questions or to offer reflections and to offer our own experiences of speaking out. I now ask Angela to come. Angela Hanlon.
Sorry, just unmuting there, Kevin. Thank you very much. And in some ways, I feel nearly a little bit of a fraud here, because speaking out was never an issue for me. However, speaking out, I think, was a barrier, because I spoke out from an age, I suppose, in my 30s, when my children were growing up and I was interested in what was going on, and I could see that the difficulties and the problems. Now, the one thing I felt was I didn't have the language or a hold of the concepts to be able to challenge very well. However, I was lucky to meet a theologian, an Irish theologian, Father Sean Fagan, who mentored me and put me in the way of reading material that was not part of my life. Like Joyce, I suppose, because of Catholicism was so bound in with being Irish, you didn't see it as something that you should explore. It was just part of the breathing. However, I suppose my first sense of querying things was when I was a child of 6 and realised only boys could be altar servers. That was kind of the start for me. And I think nearly from then on, while I always was a person of faith, I had a very jaundiced eye about church. So I wasn't afraid of speaking out. I wrote regularly to the Irish Times for a period. But the I think the effect that did have, I come from a medium-sized town with quite a stable population where people know people. I was never asked to be part of anything to do with the parish, where my husband was. And he would be, much more agreeable, and he wouldn't have had the same interest as I had, which in of itself is interesting. Where I was very interested, yet he was the one who was asked to participate. So anyway, I got the opportunity to study theology, because even geographically where I am in the country, in the centre, there was nothing available. All the best adult development was available in the coastal cities. So we were quite poorly off educationally, but I got the opportunity to study theology. And that to me was a freedom. And I've continued, I've done a master's, as I did an undergraduate, a master's, and now I'm currently undertaking PhD studies. I'm an introvert by nature, so I'm not involved in things. So for me, speaking out happens through writing, which I have been doing and contributing to magazines. Now, not in recent years because there's been family illness and that. So, but that's how, I suppose, speaking out meant that I was never invited in. Now, I had one experience of speaking out, which I'd like to share, and I was at Mass. It wasn't our parish church, but another church in the town, and the priest got up, and in some ways it was quite uncharacteristic of him, but he ranted about people, this will be back in 2008, not attending Mass. And he was it was surprising. And then he said, well, that we'd have a good population of Polish people. And he was saying, well, at least thank God for the Polish people. And I was sitting in the seat there and thinking, I am making an effort here. Does that count for nothing? And I felt like while he was pointing the finger out at the empty seats, was he not looking at the three fingers pointing back at himself and saying, well, what is it about the church that people, and I don't mean him personally, but just about the church, that people don't feel they want to be there? So anyway, I got really mad. Now, before this, I wouldn't have bothered trying to talk to anybody because to challenge someone, because I feel you're really talking into a black hole. But this time I thought, no, he's not getting away with this. So first of all, the first difficulty was trying to get a meeting. It took nearly 2 weeks before he could find a space. And that was because I just wouldn't let go. Like this day didn't suit and that day didn't suit, and I just thought, I don't mind, I can wait. So he realized I wasn't going to let go, and he agreed to a meeting, and I went. Now, he didn't know anything really about me. I knew he had dogs, but I also knew that they were Labradors and they weren't very angry or vicious dogs. But however, he didn't know that I knew that. When I knocked at the door, the dogs threw themselves at the door as if they were going to tear it down. Now, if I were someone who was afraid or nervous, this would be an incredibly frightening prospect, to hear the dogs scratching and throwing themselves at the door. He opened the door and the two big black dogs leaped out. And there again, and he made no effort to pull them down. Now, lucky enough, as I said, I like animals, so I brought the dogs under control quickly enough, and I was invited in. So I conversed, I told him what I felt, and it was all very civilized. And he had the grace to kind of be embarrassed and laugh a bit at what he did, and actually agreed that it was a bit over the top. So we chatted generally about the church and the state of things. And like I made the point, about speaking out and all the rest to him. And then he asked me, would I be interested in joining their parish council? Now, I wasn't part of that parish. And I realized then was because I talked sometimes about the difficulty that there can be in groups, and group dynamics can be very awkward. And he said to me that he asked me to join. And I just immediately said no, because I could see what was happening. He had difficult people that he couldn't control. And he was hoping to have somebody like me who would speak out. And I felt I was being used. That's all. I was a shield there. And straight away I said no. And straight away his interest in the conversation diminished. So I looked and I thanked him for his time, and I up and left. And that was my experience. Now, I have to say, because I'm a person who speaks out, I haven't suffered the experiences other people who have spoken have. But I suppose the experience of being a person who speaks out means you tend to be kept at arm's length. You're not invited in. But as I said, I'm happy to keep writing and find my voice that way. And that's what I found wonderful about Root and Branch, because it is a place of inclusion and a place where feelings and opinions and thoughts can be expressed. So I hope to continue. And one of my part of my topic for my PhD is whose knowledge counts, because this is what I feel, that if there's only one strand of knowledge within the church that has any value, and it's certainly not of women or lay people who are questioning. So I hope to follow up that way and to keep speaking out. So thank you for your time.
You need to unmute, Kevin.
Right. Okay. Thank you, Angela. And thanks to our three speakers. This is now the time when we want to hear from everybody out there. But before doing so, I do want to say a special thanks to Joyce, Rhiannon, and Angela. It is good to hear it said that Root and Branch is a place where we can speak out, where we can feel free to just to speak without worrying what the implications are. So we've heard about those are the rules, certain types of people, degradation of women just for being the way God made them. But I've also heard about reclaiming our space at the table. And I've just thought of something. When Jesus was asked who he was, he didn't give an answer. He came back and he handed the question back and said, well, who do you say I am? So it seemed like Jesus wanted us to speak out. But now it's the time to listen to you, our Root and Branchers out there, or as they say on the news, from where you are. Normally, after our speakers, we invite questions and answers, Q&A, which of course you're still welcome to ask questions, but this is more about listening to what your experiences are of speaking out. What was the turning point? What was the turning point in making you speak out? What were the consequences of that? Because it does come at a cost, as we've heard, but what were the rewards? But before opening the floor to all of you out there, I just want to share with you that we actually spent some time in Root and Branch in our core group discussing if we should record or not. You know, what is it about our church that makes us afraid to speak out openly? Having that discussion about the recording told us something that's quite telling. Why did we have to discuss this? Anyway, so can I ask those who are going to share something about experiences of speaking out to keep it as short as possible, because we want to hear from as many of you as possible. And please use the Zoom hand function, which will allow us to get to you in the correct order. So I hand over to you all. So please raise your hand and we will get to you. I see your first hand from.
Well, thank you so much, Kevin. I'm just going to come in there to say to people that at this point, we are now cutting the recording so that anyone who hasn't made it tonight can listen in to this recording in a week's time or so on our website. But contributions from the floor now are not being recorded, and I am cutting the recording now.